Hello and welcome to the Opus WealthStyle podcast. My name is Iván Watanabe here with my partner, Evan Wall. Evan, how are you?
Doing great. How's it going today?
Good, man. Good. Long time no see, right?
It's been a while.
But really excited to have our guest on today, Emily Bishop. Emily is a great friend and client, and really just an expert in this space. I'm really excited to have you on, Emily. Before we start, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself to the audience, sort of, a little bit about you, and then we'll kind of get into the topic.
Absolutely. So thrilled to be here. I'm really excited you asked me to do this, Yvonne, and right back at you at amazing person, amazing friend, and helped get our money under organization. I was going to say under control. I don't know if that's the best word.
Yeah.
So really happy to be here. So again, Emily Bishop. I am a professional fundraiser by trade. Actually, I've been a professional fundraiser for over a decade, mostly dealing with high net worth individuals who are going to make significant, sizable investments to and NGOs, nonprofits, or international NGOs. But my background before that was in public policy. I have a master's in public policy with a concentration in children, youth, and families. I worked in the U.S. Senate for a while as a legislative aide for a U.S. senator, focusing on issues of education and childcare. And I care really deeply about these issues. I also currently sit on the board of an organization called the Childcare Council of Westchester, which works to increase quality, accessibility of childcare in Westchester County in New York. I have two kids, two little kids, a 7-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. So deep in it in the childcare. And like I said, I really care deeply about this issue, both for how it affects families' everyday lives, but also, how it affects the greater economy and, of course, kids. So looking forward to jumping into this conversation.
Absolutely. So we were having a conversation recently because another client of mine was trying to wade through the options between having a nanny and having an au pair, and really just I didn't have enough information about sort of the au pair nanny space to even give them, direction, right? So it brought up the conversation around childcare and all of the different, complex equations. It feels like we end up running through to make the proper selection for each individual household, right? So, I reached out to Emily based on your work in the Childcare Council of Westchester, just to give me a lay of the land as to what the options look like and where should we be looking. And so again, I'm excited to kind of have you on. For the listening audience, the idea today is just to get some insights or really great best practices when you are searching for trying to find either an au pair, a nanny, or what, when you're wading through those daycare options, what are the things you should consider? What are the questions to ask? And I know when Joanna and I were going through that process, we had very little clue and we got very lucky, but it was kind of a nightmare to get there. So, why don't we just kind of start with, where you think best, discussing an au pair, what do you think?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think I'll sort of start by saying to any of your listeners out there, if this feels hard, it's because it is hard. To kind of zoom out before we get into these individual options, childcare is actually a crisis in this country. And, we don't have to get into all the policy details, although that is, like I said, my background. But, across the country, we're seeing households pay about 8 to 20% of their income on childcare, which I'm sure, Yvonne, that makes you cringe because that's a lot. Yeah. Mixed with really long wait lists, mixed quality in daycare. Of course, at the higher end of the income spectrum, you have way more options. Whereas if, your privilege doesn't lie there, it's really a tricky situation. So if it feels hard, it is hard. I will say I saw this meme one time that I always laugh about, where it's like, the meme was like, when you have kids, there are no childcare hacks, ... except for living near your parents, which, I think just speaks to the fact that like having extra hands around really can make a big difference. I'm not saying everyone should do that. I don't do that. Obviously not possible, but just kind of painting that broad picture. And it is a real problem in this country. So let's zoom back into micro. And I will kind of sort of start by saying there's really like three main options, I think, if you're a new family trying to figure out what to do. I think there is daycare, which could be daycare center, could be something more informal, like, your neighbor having a daycare. That is really hard to go into because it's so informal. There's not a lot of information. So I'm going to kind of leave that one aside. Let's talk about daycare centers. Then there's a nanny, which would be somebody that you hire to bring into your home. We'll talk about that a little too. And then there's an au pair, which we'll also talk about as well. So I think those are kind of like the three main buckets of what your options are. Would you agree with, do you have anything to add to that, Iván, before we kind of dive into what those options are? Or do you want to give any sort of like personal story about what option you chose or like how you made that decision?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, we're pretty set on daycare. And for us, the integration of having other kids in the mix was important. And Joanna was not all that thrilled about having somebody live with us in our space, somebody that we didn't know. So again, that's one of the challenges there. Joanna and I both work, so that was also part of the consideration that some households have to deal with. Ev, your kid? What was the structure for your kids?
Sorry, Evan, go ahead.
For us, it's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing issue. So I have 3 young kids, 2, 4, and almost 6. And my wife is home with the kids and has been since our first was born. And so, we, by the way, live 30 minutes from my in-laws, and my mother-in-law is like superwoman, the most helpful mother-in-law.
You got the parenting hack down.
Yeah, she is. And every friend that interacts with her is like, tells me that she's the best. So we're super lucky, and it's still not enough. Because she's super grandma, she helps out both with our kids and also my wife's brother and their 3 kids. So she's got 6 grandkids that she's juggling back and forth. And so, we can't take all of her time. And so having 3 young kids at home, even when they're in school or camp, driving them around to different activities, it's near impossible. And so there's always conversation of who can we find just to help out, just to be in the house. But the problem we've always run into is, like, my wife needs very specific times of when is most helpful, right? And so like a nanny or as a babysitter and a nanny, like the same thing. I don't know if that's like a degrading thing to say babysitter, but to have, someone in the house for, let's say, 2 days a week from, very specific times. There's not a lot of nannies that want that, right? They want full-time work. And so we almost feel like we're just going through nannies all the time of, we thought we found a great one, and then, maybe she found a better opportunity that was more full-time, or, so we always have someone new coming into the house, and, any help or more hands is all helpful, but it's always a conversation in our household.
Yeah, for sure. It's so hard. We have both, my older daughter was in daycare almost her whole life, take COVID out of the mix, because she was, 3, 4 when we were all home for COVID. My younger daughter was in daycare, then we had a stint with a nanny, and then we went back to daycare. I think, we'll go into some of the pros and cons, but a friend of mine, when I was pregnant with my first child, and I will say my wife and I both work full time. Obviously, that may be an important thing to start with. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine said, when I was deciding what to do about childcare with my first child, is she said, think of it this way. If your nanny has to call out sick, you have to call out sick. Whereas at daycare, if someone's sick, you have backup. That's obviously just one piece of the puzzle, but that kind of was the tipping point for us. Again, work, you need the reliability of the everyday care. COVID changed all of that. But that was the tipping point for us. We had a nanny for a short time because we couldn't get off a wait list in Westchester. And I'll tell you a little bit about my nanny experience when we get there. But for the most part, we found daycare really works well for our family for a lot of the same reasons that Iván said.
Yeah. So I think the one that I generally know the least about and sort of really does kind of seem like a black box is the au pair route. Like I don't know. I know I don't have a lot of friends or clients that have an au pair. And the very few that I do have really not had a great experience. So I'm curious, just in general, like, can you share a little bit about what it is, not necessarily like why it may work or not work, but just in general, sort of how it works?
Yeah, sure. So the au pair program is basically an international cultural exchange program. A variety of countries around the globe are entered into this official program. It's a program run by the Department of State because you need a visa to participate. So it's, sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and other international governments. So it's a genuine, legit program. You can probably get the best information about the program on the U.S. Department of State website. But basically what it is, it's like I said, a cultural exchange program that, you hire an au pair, typically through an agency. So you would work, there's private companies that help a family do this. So a quick Google search will bring up, some of the main companies basically that acts as like the intermediary or the subsidiary. So you hire someone and they come and live, from another country that is governmentally involved in this program. And that person in the United States, they have to be age 18 to 26, or that's like the United States's rule for, where they have to fall. They can work up to 45 hours a week. They are required to be fluent in English. And then you are required to pay for or to give them lodging. Usually you're required to have a specific bedroom. So you can't be like, oh, sleep on my couch for a year. Mm-hmm. And they either run for 24 months or 12 months. The term au pair, I thought this is really interesting that I think is important to call out, is actually French and it means on equal terms. So that's sort of a good lens to look at it because, you may think like, oh, I'm hiring this person to come help me out. Well, that person's also coming to get, obviously a job, but a cultural experience too. So you just want to make sure you're thinking about both sides of that equation before you were to enter into that. Like I said, a lot of online resources for, the agencies that can help you navigate a lot of this stuff if it's, something you want to do. I have two friends that have au pairs that have had good experiences. I think some of the real sticking points are, this will come up in their nanny conversation is just, but just transparency around expectations, understanding the au pairs experience as well. It's not just a job for them, it's a cultural experience for them as well. And, I think some of the stickier stuff that people have said that they've had challenges with is driving cars or what they're quote unquote can do or allowed to do, what boundaries your family has set in place on their off time, all of that kind of stuff that I think you just have to be willing as a family to understand, be clear about, and then be clear with any potential candidate. Yeah. But the two friends that I have that have au pairs say it's really, really good for flexibility because, they live with you and you can set your hours together. So one of my friends is a doctor. So her hours are all over the place. So, that really works for her with an au pair as opposed to a daycare where it's 9 to 5. My other friend, both she and her husband have real political jobs. So very round the clock kind of work. Not that your au pair can work around the clock, but, you can be more flexible with the hours, again, set up front. And they both talk about, the relationship that the au pair has with their kids. And of course, there's a learning from your kids too, it's a cultural experience for them as well. Mm-hmm. So a lot of pros, but just something, to enter into with a real seriousness.
Yeah, I think that's the one piece that obviously, until you just mentioned it, treating it as a cultural experience and something besides monetary, there's an exchange of cultures, right? There's an exchange of experiences, not just somebody from a foreign country coming to your house to take care of your kids and lives with you. Those are very two different ways to view the experience. And I think if you go in with that proper lens of the cultural experience, then you're going to view you'll have a different perspective on it. I think that's eye-opening, I think, for me in particular. And also knowing that it's sponsored by the U.S. Department of State. My perception of it was there are these agencies, there's no governing body. There's no, they can basically they're like screen. It's like, it's like mail or bride. It's like, you're basically getting matched up with this international employee. Like there's a lot of, I think maybe it's just me, but I think in general, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about the actual program. So I'm excited to hear that there's a little bit more legitimacy than what I had thought.
Absolutely. And again, two families I know, two great experiences. Of course, it's going to vary person to person, family to family, but definitely something to consider.
Yeah. I've heard both. I have clients that absolutely love their au pair, and other friends that went through a few before they found one that they liked, and just some interesting stories along the way.
Yeah.
It always amazed me that, and maybe you can speak to this, that au pair, as far as I know, au pairs are, I think, far less expensive than a nanny. You do have to provide them with lodging and food, and I think most people will provide them with a car. So there's those other expenses, but to have almost round the clock coverage to an extent, it's interesting. Like, why is it so much cheaper than a nanny?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing is that you have to look at expense more than just money. Your time, your energy costs a lot, you know what I mean? And so the time and energy, probably emotionally, that your family has to put into, I don't want to say the word managing an au pair, but adapting to life with an au pair is probably a lot. You want to, like I said, I think the most successful experiences that I've heard of are treating the au pair like a member of your family. So, that comes with conflict resolution. That comes with setting expectations up front. That comes with discussing meal plans and groceries and discussing your values. So that's an expense or a cost that you don't have with daycare. So like, do you know what I mean? I wouldn't look at it as like flat money. This is this amount of money and this is this amount of money. I think the costs show up in different ways. Yeah,
it's a completely different dynamic, right? Especially if you really are going to buy into the cultural exchange aspect of it. If you had an exchange student staying at your home, you're going to do things with them. There's going to be things beyond just the 9 to 5 aspect of it. And you're right. There's a whole bunch of other sort of nuances to that relationship that I don't think many people truly understand when they go into it. And again, this is just my perception of it. But when I thought about it for about 30 seconds, it was having somebody come here, live here, take care of my daughter,
move on,
be in my space, right? Like, and that was it was just the monetary exchange. So, but I think so for the daycare piece, moving on to that, I'm very curious kind of what your recommendations and thoughts would be around choosing a daycare, and if it's the right thing for you. Like, what's your metric?
Absolutely. So again, very personal to each family. This is the most, maybe the least emotional comment I will make probably on this whole podcast. But, I think one of the biggest things you have to consider is how this will logistically fit into your day-to-day life. Meaning, what's the commute like? Are you going to have to sit in traffic to get to to get to daycare? Is it going to add 30 minutes onto your day? Is it going to take, you know what I mean? Like the logistics really matter because you do that every day. When my oldest daughter was in daycare, we were living in Brooklyn, and it was so easy. We walked from our house to the daycare, which happened to be right next to the subway. So then we'd walk onto the subway, go to work, and coming home off the subway to the daycare, walk home. The logistics were so easy. And there were ups and downs of that daycare. For the most part, it was wonderful. But every time we encountered a bump on the road, we were like, this is so easy. There's no reason to change this. And I just, I've spoken to other friends. We had an experience when we first moved out to Westchester that the only daycare we could be in was about a 25-minute drive away. So that was drive 25 minutes, drop off our child, drive 25 minutes back, and sometimes do it again at the end of the day. And that took a toll on us as parents. It took a toll on my older daughter, who was having to come along on the ride with us. And at that time, my younger daughter was really little. So she would sleep in the car, mess up the nap schedule. So I really can't like overestimate logistics here.
Yeah.
And I'm such an emotional person that it seems almost crazy for me to say that, but it really matters.
Yeah,
So
the,
that's kind
the
of like,
practicality is extremely important, right? I mean, it's just,
absolutely.
that's yeah, absolutely. And it will definitely make up for those minor bumps in the road that, as long as your child is cared for, you can really you can really excuse a lot of other things if the
Absolutely.
logistics work
Yeah.
out really well.
Yeah. And I think like transitioning away from logistics, that flexibility piece is big. I think if you're going to be successful at a daycare, you have to go in with a flexible mindset, and understand also from the daycare's point of view too, and what I mean by this is they're not going to necessarily do things exactly the way you're going to do them at your house. And because they're caring for a bunch of kids, you can't say you need to do it this way. They have rules to follow. They have protocols to follow. They're doing what's best for the group. So you have to have a flexible mind going into it if you want to have a successful experience. For me, that was a real learning curve. I wanted my kid to sleep at the right time, to eat specific things. And it actually helped me grow as a parent to lean into that flexibility. So, and I think it can be really good for the kids too. So that's kind of like one other thing I'll say about daycare. But what you asked about was choosing a daycare. And I think a couple things to think about. One, make sure they're accredited by national organizations. You'll see that on their door. Probably there's a little sticker that says accredited by, there's a couple different childcare organizations that can accredit. So I don't want to say like one is better than the other. But if they're accredited, they're probably following all the rules. Obviously licensed and all that. Most states have pretty strict rules about daycare, child to teacher ratio, things like, they can't sleep with other things in the crib. I mean, as long as they're following those rules, you're going to be pretty safe. You're in a good situation. You're probably going to be in a pretty good situation. So that's kind of like the baseline. Next, I would say try to observe a classroom. See how the teachers feel. So much of this comes down to teachers, individual personnel. And you can be in a great daycare and have one teacher that doesn't mesh with your kid, or be in a not great daycare and have a teacher that's really great. So like there's so much there. And unfortunately, we have a massive childcare worker shortage because of really low wages. Again, that's another policy problem, but just understanding that that's where you're going into. And then keep in mind long wait lists. There's really an accessibility challenge as well, mostly due to that worker shortage, due to low wages. And so, it's not crazy that if you're pregnant to get on a wait list for a daycare that you like. That's totally normal. I think this is where like a local Facebook group can really come into play. Like if you look on Facebook, if you're a new parent, joining a local Facebook group for parents in that area, peruse around, you'll see people chattering about different daycares and where has a good reputation, where has a bad reputation. Obviously take everything with a grain of salt, because what works for someone's family isn't going to work for everyone's. But things like that. The organization that I sit on the board of, Childcare Council of Westchester, does have like a directory of all the local daycares, where has wait lists, where doesn't, who's accredited, all that kind of stuff. So if you're local, you can go to their website, check that out. But those are some things to consider. There are some other like really specific questions you can ask yourself. Things like, what's the daily routine? Do you have a curriculum? How many, is there staff turnover? A lot of those regular questions you can ask. I just would really be cautious about putting too much weight on like one thing, because it's people, it's a business. Like, do you know what I mean? There's just so much that goes into it. And maybe there is a lot of staff turnover, but maybe that's because they can't afford to pay their staff as well as they should. There's just so much that goes into it. So if it feels good, it's probably going to be good.
Yeah, I think the advice for folks of when you are pregnant to start interviewing or start going to different places, because those wait lists, at least in Westchester, were significant for us. I mean, we made the decision that Mia was going to go to daycare as soon as she could. And I think that started, if I remember, at 10 weeks. That was the youngest that an infant could. Yeah.
They'll accept. I've seen more like 16 weeks, but I
think it was somewhere in that realm. And we had interviewed a bunch of different daycares. We ended up going with a place that was local to us. It was like 7 minutes away. and everything. They were opening up a brand new location. And so we were very excited about that. And then I think about a week before Mia was supposed to go to school or to daycare, Joanna went online, saw the place again to download the forms, and there was 15 different comments about how bad the daycare was that had popped up since we had gone. And obviously there was a little bit of a crisis meltdown in the house, and we started looking at all the different daycares and calling. We probably called 35, 40 places. Yep. Nobody had an open spot except for one. Yep. And one that we would like. We got very lucky because it happens to be right next to my office. But starting that process early, going to the Facebook pages, and consistently checking in before you start, it was the second piece, because that really, we could have been in some trouble if we weren't able to find that place. But the wait lists were, hey, yeah, absolutely, we've got a spot for you, no problem. The spot's available, 5 months from now. It wasn't like you could start tomorrow. So I think that's great advice.
Really hard.
Ivan, does Mia's daycare have a camera, like a live camera? And if so, how often are you checking it?
Yeah. So they send pictures. They don't have a live camera in the classroom. I think I would not get any work done. I would have my screen set up, and I'd have like a separate screen that's probably larger than my regular screens, just watching her all day. But that was one for us where we were getting constant picture updates and constant updates on what she's eating that day, and when she started her nap, and any other things that we need to know. So that was a big piece for us, is the ongoing communication throughout the day was one of our major criterias when we were looking at location, right? So again, beyond the logistics of it, like how are we being communicated with through the staff, and that for us was important. Others will give you like a sheet at the end of the day and tell you how her day was or how their day was.
I love the updates. I just love them. It's so hard, but I love them.
There's nothing you can do about it in that particular moment, but it's just like, oh yeah, my kid eats better than I do. I'm just glad she's having a good day.
Yeah.
And I think for us that's definitely was very big on our list.
Two other things that I want to mention about daycare, if this is what you're considering, is consider sick policies. So, this is definitely, I would say, I personally have a lot of positives for daycare. For me, it's absolutely the way. I'm happy we went with our family, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. But one pretty significant negative is if your kid is sick, there's usually some pretty strict policies around, not sending your kid to daycare, obviously to make sure other kids don't get sick, but it can really disrupt your work week. So again, as long as you're prepared, as long as you know it, whatever you need to do to get by. But I think that's something to go eyes wide in with there. Last week, my youngest daughter had hand, foot, and mouth, and she was out all week. And by the end of the week, she was basically fine, but she couldn't go back yet for contagious reasons. Obviously, I understand, but it can throw a real wrench in things. So be aware of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of the group structure has so many positives, but the health piece of it is extremely challenging. And that's, it's one of the things that you can control is somewhat with a nanny, right? I think that is one big difference for having a nanny. So the nanny space, I don't know much about, so I'm curious, kind of what your process is like. And again, I think that is becoming more and more popular, at least amongst the folks that I have a conversation with that are deciding to go with something a little bit more individualized, especially, post COVID, right? With the pandemic sort of behind us now, people are more and more aware of the kids getting other kids sick, and again, that major inconvenience. So, if you don't mind, just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So we had an experience with a nanny, and it really happened because we were on wait lists. We couldn't do it. We couldn't get on a childcare in a daycare because the wait lists were too long. So we hired a nanny. And it was a great experience. But there are some challenges to having a nanny. Yeah, we found her on care.com. Did we find her on care.com? Nope. We found her feel free to edit that if you want to.
That's fine.
We found her on care.com. No, wait. Oh my God. We didn't even find her on care.com. Okay. We found our nanny on a Facebook group, a local Facebook group that, helped connect caregivers with families. And I don't even think I made a post. I think I was looking through other people's posts, saw potential nannies sending in messages, and I just privately reached out to her, and we really jived right from the start. I think there's a couple of things that I would really advise someone going into a nanny situation to really think about before they do it. I think you should really treat it like a job, treat it like you're hiring. Again, we're looking for childcare because we have jobs. So most people are listening to this are familiar with hiring and management. And as weird as it can seem to treat it like you're hiring, it's really the best way, because you're paying someone, you have expectations for them to do a job, and you want them to meet their expectations. So, have a conversation with your partner, your spouse, around what your values are as a family. Do you want your nanny to bring those to the table? What your expectations are, what you want in that job description. Make a job description, share it with, your potential clients or potential nannies, and have an interview process, have questions written down. Really take it seriously, because the work on the front end is going to pay off. I'll go back to the values piece for a second. This was something that I'm glad I thought of. I thought of it at the last minute, but I thought of it because this is how I do a lot. I think about in my own professional life, but like a company has values. You want to hire somebody that is aligned with your company's values. And so my wife and I looked at each other and said, what are our values? And how are we going to make sure our nanny aligns with that? And for us, we're a 2-mom family. So we wanted to make sure that our nanny was coming into our space, being positive about that family structure, being open-minded. And so we were really explicit about that up front. And I think that allowed us to, having that open conversation at the front end, really allowed us to have a good relationship moving forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's incredibly important. It's funny. I haven't seen it out here in Westchester that much, but oftentimes you'll go to the city and you'll see nannies that are pushing a cart or the stroller, and they'll have on scrubs, right? Or they'll have on, some type of uniform that sort of makes a clear distinction that they are working with or for the family, and that they're not the parent of that child. And I think that sets for that particular family, sets sort of a boundary that this person is part of our family, but also works for and with our family. They're not, they're not the parent, right? Or they're not the right, or the grandparent, right? And for whatever reason, that's important to that family. I think that boundary or those values are incredibly important to set up front. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. I'm sure, it's on one hand, it's probably easier to tell, someone that that's literally employed by you than your in-laws, Evan, around what you want them to do or not to.
That's certainly a good point.
But, there's that too. Then, so kind of like moving into the next step. So you hire someone, again, good places to look. Care.com is great. Most people I know use care.com. I've hired one-off babysitters from care.com. Care.com also has a great resource that they can help you figure out how to pay your nanny with, making sure you're following all like tax rules and all that. They can help you with that. So that's a really good resource. But again, local Facebook groups, really, not trying to uber promote meta over here, but there's a lot to be said for, connecting with your community. And most of the time that happens on Facebook. But so say, you do your interview, you get a great nanny, and you're about to start. I think the other biggest piece for me was, again, creating a contract, like you would if you're hiring an employee. And, things that we made really clear in that contract were, expectations. Like I said, this is probably in your job description, but can also be in your contract. Think of things like, do you want them to be on their phone? Do you want to say something that you don't want to see them on their phone when you're with your child? Obviously within realistic boundaries. What about TV? Can TV be, if you have an infant, can TV be on in the background or no? What about if the kid's sleeping? Are they allowed to watch TV or no? I mean, these are small questions, but it's really worth being explicit up front. If they take your kid out of the house for the day, do you want them to tell you that in advance, or do they not need to? What about chores? What are your expectations about chores, food prep? Again, be explicit up front. And then, finally, really crucial, decide about their days off. How many vacation days will they get? How many sick days will they get? What if it's a holiday? Will they get paid holidays? What about if they have jury duty? That happened to our nanny. She got jury duty. And that was like, I swear to God, we had the most best contract I could ever think of, but I didn't think of jury duty. So, that was something in the moment. I was just like, oh yeah, go to jury duty. We'll pay you. Great. And then my wife was like, we're going to pay her for jury duty. Again, I'm not saying one way is good or bad. It's just think about it up front. So you don't have to deal with it.
That's a big one.
Transparent with your nanny so they know what to expect. If they have to leave an hour early for a doctor's appointment, are you still going to pay them the same day, or are you going to pay them 7 hours instead of 8 hours? If they have kids and their kid is, can their kid come with them for the day? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Social media. Do you want to say something like, don't put pics of my kid on social media? Do you want to say that's okay? Like, there's just all these things that are really worthwhile to think of up front. It can cause you a lot of headaches.
Yeah, because I think the contract aspect of it, and again, your approach of hiring this person is really important, because that boundary can get I would imagine can get really blurred as this person is spending years, hopefully years with you and your family. They end up becoming part of the family, but there still needs to be that sort of professional dynamic there. Again, they're not your in-laws. They're not doing this for free. You're paying them. They do work for the family, and there's got to be some black and white lines drawn so that it doesn't mess with the personal relationship, I would imagine. Right. So that's one of the things that you shared with me previously, Emily, that I thought was so important, is just setting those dynamics up front. Right. And I think you bring up, especially with the sick days, right? And the days off, because you don't want to feel guilty as somebody that has this person in part of your life. But again, you're also their employer of, do I give them an extra sick day? Like, what happens if they're really, but because you also have to hire somebody else, right? So now you're doubling down on that cost for somebody that works for you. There's gotta be, I would recommend, and I totally back you up on this, some sort of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And I think we've used that word several times on this, and I think that makes a lot of sense, in that relationship. The daycare sets the boundaries for you. You know exactly how much you're paying, when they're on, when they're off, what you're going to get for it. But these other people that you introduce into your life, a nanny or au pair, has different structures in place.
I love the conversation around expectations, and and that's all great. But I find the other side is, because we're always struggling to find a consistent nanny, and for us, it's not a full-time nanny, so it's a part-time nanny or babysitter, et cetera. So, having those expectations, it's hard enough to find someone that can show up on the times that we need. And so I'm always encouraging my wife to just like, if we went out to dinner and, because we're paying them hourly, right? So if we went out to dinner, it was like 2.5 hours, like just round up, just give her an extra few dollars, because I want her to want to work for us.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. And so
100%.
I almost, I would love to have the expectation conversation and like draft a contract, but like, I want her to come back. Most importantly, like I want her to be a resource for our family. And so it's a balancing act, like be at the same time, you gotta be employable, or be a good employer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you make a really good point, Evan, too. I mean, a lot of this stuff I'm talking about is like if you're hiring someone full time. So I think it's really different when you're hiring someone for like date night babysitter, whatever. I certainly don't hire my date night babysitters with a contract, but that would take way too much time. But I think you make a really good point about paying. I mean, you're going to figure out what rate to charge, which is best for your family. But at the end of the day, like, you want somebody to want to work for your family, and like, really, money talks. I mean, and I think showing them that you value them by making sure you pay them for the work that they're doing. is really important. And anybody, any parent that spends time with their kid knows that it is hard work.
Invaluable.
So like,
Absolutely.
pay these people well. And,
Yeah.
they'll, I think you'll see a lot of payoff there. So that's really good.
Absolutely. So Emily, as we kind of wrap up here today, what do you want to leave the audience with? You've given some great insights on all three different structures. Anything in particular you want to make sure that the folks kind of take away from the conversation today?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I'm talking through this, I think the theme of a lot of this and each of the scenarios, again, this is really on a micro level. Be really explicit. I think that's the biggest thing. Transparency, be explicit, talk about your values, talk about, be explicit about what you expect and what works for you. And, have open communication. I mean, on one hand, yes, you're employing someone. On the other hand, these are people and these are your kids. So, it's better to have the hard conversations than to not have the hard conversations. And the sooner you have the hard conversations, the easier it is. And the fewer problems you run in down the road. Be respectful. And I think that's really that's sort of on the micro level. I think on the macro level, I would be remiss if I didn't call out again how much of a crisis childcare is in this country. I think, again, COVID caused a lot of childcare centers to have to really scale back or close because, they weren't getting the business, which resulted in really low wages for childcare workers as daycares tried to pick back up again. And those wages haven't really picked up, but the costs have gone up. And so it's just a real crisis, both for families across all incomes, especially people on the lower end of the income scale, and especially for workers. I read something recently that said in 2022, the childcare crisis cost the U.S. economy $1.2 billion in general growth because, if people can't get childcare, they can't work. So just sort of thinking about that, as you take your own, do your own homework around what kind of policies matter to you and all that. I think it's really important to think about it in both the small picture and the big picture.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, Emily. I really, really appreciate it. And to you, the listening audience, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to click subscribe below to be notified when we release our next podcast.